Okay, Lynn, this question comes from a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, actually a congressman. He says, Mr. LaRouche, last week, after the caucus luncheon, one of our members brought up the fact that right now there's lobbying going on from the financial institutions that we just bailed out with taxpayer money. And they are lobbying basically about the various proposals to regulate and re-regulate the financial system. And this particular member pointed out that this is just outrageous. And I agree with him. But I think that the outrage that we are seeing from the population is not simply limited to the kind of anger that we saw in the streets of Chicago a couple of weeks ago when the American Bankers Association met. Although I would point out that the only institution in America that has a lower approval rating than the U.S. Congress is the Federal Reserve. He said the anger in the streets of Chicago was not all that dissimilar from the anger that we saw in the streets of Washington from people who were protesting the president's health care proposal. I think it was also evident in the elections that took place last week, where the phenomena was not simply the ouster of Democrats, but really the ouster of incumbents. It is also the case, as I'm sure you know, that right now a greater number of voters identify themselves as independents than voters who identify themselves as Democrats or Republicans. And I believe that this is a first in America's political history. But the bottom line is that while I may agree that all of this anger is justified, it does raise the question, and that is where this anger is going to go. If there's not a constructive program that people can identify with, then my fear is that there will be a destructive program that they will identify with, and that this will come along and come along very soon. You've done a great deal of writing and talking about the parallels between the situation we face today and the situation that the world faced in the period prior to the Second World War. My question to you is, in addition to the immediate economic crisis that we face, my fear is that we also face a major social crisis, and that if we do not find a constructive solution to the economic problem, that what we are going to find ourselves with is an extremely destructive social problem. And I'm wondering if you would comment on how you see this overall.
Well, we're living in a society in which the President of the United States is totally immoral in the most extreme sense of the term, in which the behavior of most Americans has been immoral for a long period of time. They may not think so, but I know so. See, I was there. I watched many of them get born. I watched their children get born. And I've been watching this process. And I must say, the manufacturing of people has not been a very good, good example these days. So I think we have to look at, yes, we do have to worry about these kinds of things, but I think we also have to think about them in much more constructive terms. Let's go back. Where did this happen? Go back to the post-war period, post-World War II period. And I can tell you what happened. As I referred to this earlier today, on the question of what I encountered Para, where these guys asked to meet with me, and I discussed this question of the implications of the death of President Roosevelt. From about that time, when Truman got in, what had happened is that in Roosevelt's last term, once in particular, the Normandy invasion had succeeded. All hell began to break loose. And we saw this also in the election campaign of 1944, where the Republican line and some Democrats was downright evil. Here we'd gone through against evil in the 1920s. Woodrow Wilson was evil. Teddy Roosevelt was evil. Coolidge was evil. Hoover was evil. We'd gone through this. Roosevelt steps in like a miracle and helps us save the United States. And this continued. There was much opposition to him, but it continued. He did the job. He returned us to the American constitutional standard. Then what happened? 1944, June 1944, the beaches in Normandy were breached. The German military, the Wehrmacht command, was ready to negotiate terms of surrender. And with the help of the British, the Wehrmacht commanders who wanted for peace at that time were assassinated, betrayed by the British. And then we had a continuation. Roosevelt died. His last election campaign was bitter. A swine from Wall Street, effectively. Truman came in. And by the time I got back to the States in the spring of 1946, hell had taken over. The American people were very cowardly and changed, corrupted, filled with greed. Then we had institutions that went along with this, trying to war with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union never had intended to attack us, particularly Roosevelt's United States. We started the war. The British organized it. It wasn't done by the United States. It was by the British. Bertrand Russell was one of the organizers, a man of evil. And so we got into this question of war. We shut down much of our productive potential because the British wanted us to shut it down. We went back to supporting colonialism where Roosevelt had worked to wreck it. And we destroyed ourselves by culture, by cultural warfare. You had things like the Congress for Cultural Freedom in the United States, organized by pigs like John Train and people like him, who I came up against, one of my enemies. Yeah? These kinds of things, you had the idea of the same thing in the United States. And people talk about, I don't believe in conspiracy theories. What's that? That's outright moral degeneracy. You don't believe in conspiracy theories? What kind of a moral degenerate are you? No, because mankind operates on the basis of conspiracy. How else can you communicate? If you don't deliberate the question of what causes are and what results are, what the relationship between the two is, how can you govern? No, by saying this, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, or by the behaviorists, such as the authoritarian personality crowd, or these kinds of things, or what was quoted by Paul Krugman, in the New York Times editorial page yesterday. Krugman acted like a pig, repeating that kind of garbage for the Times, against the protest movement against what Obama is doing in South Carolina and elsewhere today. That's completely immoral. So as a result of that, and as a result of the anti-classical cultural modalities, the existentialist mode in culture in Europe and in the United States, we destroyed the morality of the American people. We particularly destroyed their propensity for creativity. The American people became less creative, again, over the generation after generation. The 68ers were complete pigs. That whole generation, students on the leading universities in large numbers, like Mark Rudd and Company at Columbia and elsewhere, actual pigs. The whole movement was one of pigs, degraded. So we lost the cultural characteristics of creativity by this kind of change. And that's what our problem is today. And my view is there are only two things you can do about it. I've always fought against this stuff. I've hated it. It's rotten. It's evil. But the only thing you can do is, first of all, don't just complain about it. Conspire against it, number one. Number two, let your conspiracy be of the form of going to those in the area of the imagination of what we can do to change these things, to make things better, to go back to a higher standard of morality, to think about future generations, to think about what we look like to future generations, that sort of thing. Go back to it. Because you have to deal with this evil which dominates the United States people today, which is how most of the way we afflict ourselves with these problems. By degenerate culture, the rock, drug, sex, counterculture was evil. It destroyed the people who believed in it, who participated in it. They lost their morality, their ability to judge. They became miserable. They hated productivity. They hated people who wear blue shirts. And their shirts were not exactly white themselves, when you think the places they rolled in. So the point is that we are in trouble because we lost our morality as a nation, as Europe did too. We gave it up, and we began to behave like pigs. And we went after especially science and classical art, classical artistic composition. Because creativity does not come from mathematics. Some mathematicians may be creative, but it's not the mathematics that made them creative. Creativity comes from the imagination, but in a very special way. It comes by recognizing what lies beyond what you already know. And how does this function? It doesn't function in mathematics. Creativity is not mathematical. Creativity is artistic. How? The imagination in drama, in music, in poetry, in painting. What do? You are exploring the imagination. You're not just doing whatever you imagine. You're exploring the imagination to try to find out what is true. Huh? That's what all great scientists and all great creative people do. They go to the limits of the imagination and try to sort out what it is that they believe, or would like to believe, is true and what is false. And by testing the frontiers of your own imagination with a moral purpose of sorting out what you know is true and what you know is not true. This is where human creativity is expressed. Without this habit, without this kind of culture, you don't have morality, you don't have the imagination, you don't have creativity. And what we have done by this culture, the post-World War II culture, typified by this existentialist culture. We destroyed that. We destroyed it in its most vulnerable places, in classical artistic composition. And when you take the violin away from Albert Einstein, you have lost creativity. And that's what we've lost. And therefore, what we must do today is to go to the limits of the imagination a habit which is more to do with art than with physical science. But apply that to the thinking about physical scientific work. And drive this society through the imagination to discover what must become rather than merely what is. And when you do that, when people realize what it is for the first time to be really human, because most people in society don't know what human is. Because if they don't have a sense of beauty, of the aesthetic of beauty in the imagination, they don't know what human is. They would like to have something that feels good, but they don't have it because they denied a sense of classical artistry and the role of the imagination in classical artistry. That's where morality comes from. It doesn't come from mathematics of how you calculate somebody. It comes from what you imagine is the beauty of the way they function. You talk about a beautiful person, a beautiful soul, a person who exhibits qualities of humanity and the imagination and creative insight, which makes say these are good people. That's the purpose of society. And when you destroy creativity and destroy the classical cultures of a people, in which the deepest powers of creativity are located in their classical heritage, you destroy them as people. You destroy their morality. You reduce them to something like animals, which is what's been done. And when we fight against odds and fight against the pricks and kick them, then we are discovering our own morality. And the first person you're saving is yourself. When you fight for your own moral view of the nature of man and man's future, and when you see this filth like the destruction which is occurring now with the Obama presidency, which is even worse than the George W. Bush presidency, when you see that and you see people defending that, when you see people defending Obama, his health care policy, which is the Nazi Hitler policy, with the AMAC program, then you know you have no morality. And when you see a friend of yours who's in that rut, you know he has no morality either. And you begin to wonder about where the nation and the world is going. And it's only when you fear and hate that degeneracy and think about practical ways to destroy it that you find the way out.